And they'll tell you, probably be able to recite it in Hebrew. They can pull out of the archives of their bar mitzvah and some of the early training that maybe they received as a kid growing up in church. But the Shema, here it is. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And there it is in the Hebrew, unpointed. And right here in the middle of the activity for Moses, as he's unpacking and instructing, he gives a pretty emphatic charge. The word Shema, that first word in Hebrew in red there, is an interesting word. Not only does it mean hear, but it also means obey, which is interesting. So if I wanted to get really creative here and to modify the picture here that I keep coming to with what authentic faith looks like in the Old Testament, I get really goofy and I draw ears. That's just really strange, but the idea of hearing and obeying. So in the Hebrew understanding of all of this, there's no disconnect between hearing the words and obeying the words with one Hebrew word, Shema. So central to Moses is the Shema. Hear, obey, O Israel. The Lord is our God. The Lord is one, or the idea might be the Lord alone. So there's some scholarly debate about how the Shema ending there is really to be translated. It's either the Lord is one, in terms of there's only one Lord, the idea of oneness there, or oneness, in some scholars prefer the idea of the Lord alone. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. The idea of the singularity of heart. So if there's one Lord, that calls for a singularity of allegiance, or the loyalty is focused on one thing. So the singularity, their idea. So that's a whole other scholarly debate. Now what's interesting about this, where it goes next, look at verse 5. What are the implications of hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone? What? It immediately goes to the heart, right? Love the Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. Oh, there's a song there, right? I just can't get it. So you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your might, your entire being. You've heard this in sermons before. What's interesting about the idea of love, and this is something that I encourage all of you to clear this up with your youth group, with your Sunday school classes, and with your congregations, is love in the ancient world. And when you see love being used in a context like this, we're not talking about warm fuzzies, Hallmark card expressions and things like that. I have good vibes about God. What we're talking about is love means loyalty. And the reason that we know that is because in ancient correspondence, now I come to the ancient world often, and sometimes there's some things that we can recognize in the ancient world that are helpful in understanding the categories and the language that's used by Old Testament authors. But this is something that's pretty clear. In the ancient world, you have kings writing to each other. We have evidences of their correspondence. You can go over to the library, and there's a section of ancient texts that have been translated in English. Ancient Near Eastern treaties and all of these things. Kings would write to other kings, and what we see in how they talked one to another is you have the suzerain king writing to the vassal king, and he'd say, I love you. You are my son. All this, I am your father. All of this kind of familial language is used king to king. And this the family terminology was used king to king. So what he'd say after this is, you love me, I love you. Follow through with what I've contracted you to do in our covenant agreement or our treaty agreement. So love would be demonstrate loyalty to me. I am the top king, you are my lesser king, but you are my son. Love me, I love you. Love is just, I'm not talking about some odd relationship here. It's just the way kings would discuss and try to focus in on their loyalty and because they were in a covenant relationship with each other. So that's kind of significant. So if we talk about that in the biblical context, Moses, I think, is bringing that idea into his discussion as he's summoning Israel as a nation to articulate and express that same kind of loyal, faithful follow-through kind of posture. With all of this terminology, fear the Lord, love the Lord, all of these things are being brought into it. Now as we continue on in chapter 6, after the Shema, closely associated with the charge of the Shema to love the Lord your God is the charge to parents. So those of you who want to encourage parents, the parents and families of your congregation, this is a great text. Notice the teaching ministry now is extended to mom and dad within the household structure. Verse 7, and you shall teach them diligently to your sons and to your daughters, and talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up, and you shall bind them as signs on your hands, and they shall be as frontlets on your foreheads, and in the ornation decorations of your daily workaday world, what you put on in the morning when you go to work, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So, just a few things there, but you get the idea that how are parents to integrate the instructional ministry, the mandate that they have as parents to raise their kids up with the knowledge and an awareness so that they too can be little kids with this concept etched into their hearts and minds. What does it mean to walk in faithfulness and fidelity and follow through? We're not perfect parents, but there's always an indicating sign as your kids go off to college. What do they do when you're not around? That's the real test. Tell me about that. They do leave the They go off on their own, and what they do when you're not around is an indicator of maybe how successful you might have been in instructing. And Ellen and I have tried to be, we've tried to be warts and off with our kids. We let them see us, isolate them from our occasional spats and conflicts, but we want them to see us working out the conflicts. And what does it look like to have an authentic marriage? One where we are trusting in the Lord for finances through difficult times. We talk to our kids about, things and how we're handling things. I want them to see me when they wake up and go to school. If I'm sitting there reading my Bible and having my own quiet time and getting them involved in church, not pushing them, but they find what they want to, how they serve in the church. Our kids were not as excited about youth group, and our church is kind of a little bit cliquey because when high school has all the representation, so they would have been the only kids from their high school in my churches. So what they did was they got involved in the puppet ministry, which is really cool because they got involved in a close-knit group of kids that were all, pretty genuine and walking with the Lord, and they had an outreach ministry, puppet ministry. They do live shows in different venues, and that was what my kids got involved in, and so James and Hannah are both involved in churches in their college towns. We didn't send them to a private Christian college. They chose to go there. We let them make those decisions, but now they're becoming adults. It's the next phase, and they've got boyfriends, and this stuff. You know what?
Got a boyfriend?
My daughter, yeah, she's got a boyfriend.
She got a boyfriend.
She's got a boyfriend. Does that surprise you, my daughter? Uh-oh, you're being silent. Oh, you don't think daughters should date? Are you a member of the Dads Against Daughters Who Date? Are you part of that club? No, let's not get into this now. All right. Well, let's take a look. We're in chapter 6. So this teaching, ministry, and expression. So we talked about Israel's loyalty. This is the fidelity. Now the challenge is, let's take a look at the challenge here in chapter 6, beginning of verse 10. It's interesting how efficient Moses is getting to the real heart of the matter. So while he's just given this is what loyalty looks like. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. In the instructional teaching ministry of you parents, here are the trappings, the downfalls, the pitfalls. Verse 10. Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to give you great and splendid cities which you did not build. The reason why the battle needed to be fought God's way is that they weren't going in there with sledgehammers and, bombs blowing up everything. They were not supposed to do that. Cities that are still intact. Houses full of good things which you did not fill. Hewn cisterns which you did not dig. Vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. You shall eat and be satisfied. So that's what is going to be Israel's experience if they are heart with feet, following through the way that the battle should be fought. But then you've got one of those big butts of the Bible in verse 12. Then watch yourself, lest you forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall fear only the Lord your God. You shall worship him alone and swear by his name. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you. For the Lord your God is in your midst. He's a jealous God. Otherwise, the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and he'll wipe you off the face of the earth. How intense are we here? This sounds like another Genesis chapter 6 episode all over again. Well, he's going to, the translation there can go earth or land. And probably what we see there is a reference to potential exile. So early on we have, and Moses is going to unpack this. The theology of the future for Israel will have a fork in the road woven into its very fabric. So, blessing in the land, or if you live like pagans, or if you become more pagan than the pagans around you, exile. Moses lays it out all the way in the book of Deuteronomy. So you can see that down the road when the prophets start screaming on the streets through their megaphones, preaching on the street, Jeremiah and all of these prophets that are giving advanced warning, they're drawing from Deuteronomy. They're saying we should know better. Moses warned us from the very beginning why the exile will happen. And if it's just around the corner, if the Assyrians are starting to threaten the northern border cities, or eventually the Babylonians are coming and threatening to knock down the walls of our capital city, Jerusalem, we know why, because Moses has told us. He told us why even before we got here. So this is where it all comes from, the legal case later on. So this is the biggest challenge that Israel's going to have, forgetting. This idea of forgetting. Let's spend a little time talking about this. And it's interesting, Moses here sets up the case that forgetting the Lord can happen in times of plenty just as easily as in times of fasting or feasting. Good or bad. You've got blessing, you've got times of you can forget the Lord in both situations. And so he's looking ahead. He's looked behind at the past, but now he's looking ahead and he's warning them. This is a situation in chapter 8. Let's turn there. Let's see here. Forgetting God. Let's just let's see. The threat of forgetting God we have in chapter 6 there in verse 12. He continues that theme of forgetting here into chapter 7. Let's just spend a little time talking about that. And let's have, let's see here. Let's have Nancy. Why don't you read for us there in chapter 7, starting in verse 1.
Chapter 7 or 8?
Chapter 7. I was jumping ahead to chapter 8. But I want to go back to chapter 7 here.
Was it 5?
I think so.
Okay. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Pezerites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you.
You didn't think you'd have to do that
I
today,
think,
did you?
yeah, that's hard on a Monday. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me and serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus shall you deal with them. You shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars, and chop down their asherim, and burn their carved images with fire.
Okay, so this is what forgetting, the extreme form of forgetting Yahweh looks like. When the paganism of the land and the people that represent the paganism and all forms and expressions of paganism is not utterly driven out of the land, when you forget the Lord, you become pagan. You forget Him. You worship other gods. You leave Him behind. And in the marriage context, you end up walking out of your marriage commitment. You walk away from your spouse. You leave, and you're off doing something else in the red light district. It's interesting, the prophet Hosea is going to illustrate this down the road for Israel. And he's going to come back to this, the very heart of the whole illustration of the marriage relationship, God being married to His people, and what Israel has done in the person of Gomer. And what Hosea illustrates is the unwavering commitment of God to go back and to bring home and to say, you are my wife, start acting like it. Now that's down the road, but it comes back to this, and what Moses is saying. Because look at verse 6. He comes back to the very heart of it. He comes back to that intimate marriage language that we saw back in Exodus 19, all the way back at Mount Sinai. That I call that the marriage ceremony. He says in verse 6, here's why I'm so jealous. Here's why I'm so animate about the threat of paganism. It's because you are a holy people to Yahweh your God, to Yahweh. For the Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for His special treasure, His segulah. He can't leave that word behind. Segulah keeps coming back out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set His love on you, nor chose you because you were more numerous than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all the peoples. But why? Because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which He swore to your forefathers. The Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know, maybe he points to his head, know therefore, that's pretty emphatic, that the Lord your God, He is God, the faithful God, who keeps His covenant and His loving kindness to 1,000th generation with those who love Him and keep His commandments. And guess what the prophets do? When the enemies do come, and they start to threaten with siege warfare, and you're trapped inside your walled city, and you know the enemy is outside. They're just waiting for you to starve, run out of food, run out of water, or give up. And when the prophet is on the inside of the city, he basically says to those who are inside Jerusalem, yeah, that's God's plan A for us. We need to go. That was like high treason. Got him in trouble. He was in the stockades. You know the prophet Jeremiah. But there was a group around who were asking a different set of questions. And we always, from this point on, we need to keep track of the fact that there was always a faithful remnant who looked like this. Always within the larger community of unfaithful Israel. And the faithful remnant they just had their quiet time in passages like this. And given the threat of chaos that's just around the corner, they were asking this question of the prophet, has God forgotten us? Has God forgotten us? What is His what next for us? What are we supposed to do? And you see that the prophets will take their gaze away from the group of unfaithful majority and to this little group over here. Marley, you just squeaked in. Sorry. But the faithful remnant, which is in the minority at that time, you all were asking a different set of questions. In the prophetic encouragement to you oftentimes would go to places like the day of the Lord. There's a future, there's a hope, God has not forgotten you. He's going to come again, and when he does, he's going to establish his kingdom. The lion lays down with the lamb. There's going to be river flowing from the temple, and blessing will be coming from you forth to you and through you to bless all of those nations that will be coming up. They'll be coming up to Jerusalem to receive Torah instruction. All of these things you'll be a part of, and that's your future. So no, God hasn't given up on you, but you still have to go with them. You still have to walk with the majority over here. We're all going to Babylon, and you have to go too. But don't forget that God hasn't given up on you. It's just, his timing is mysterious, and it's going to be hard. But you still have to go. See? So this is coming from the foundation that we have here in Deuteronomy. And so we move over to chapter 8, and you see we're still in chapter 7. And they come back to this, and they're confident because God's unconditional promises that he gave to the patriarchs. Oftentimes the prophets will be going back to places like the Davidic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant, and these unconditional, God's going to do these things, It just hasn't happened yet. All right, let's look at chapter 8 here. And let's see here. I want Cole. Where are you? There in the back. Read for us, and we'll move ahead here to chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. Go ahead and read that.
All the commandments that I am commanding you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your forefathers. You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He humbled you and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. Thus you are not to know in your heart, thus you are to know in your heart that the Lord your God was disciplining you, just as a man disciplines his son.
So like what I just kind of focused on, the prophetic focus on the faithful remnant. Now Moses is dealing with a new generation. You might consider a larger component of the faithful remnant. This new generation, they're asking the question, look, we've just gotten out of this wilderness experience. We're on the plains of Moab. But Moses, what you're telling us, how are we to understand this experience that we just went through? What's the theological high point what's our walk away? So this is an appropriate question for this post-wilderness experience generation, and you see the theology of the wilderness experience. What's interesting is that the prophets who address the wilderness experience to come will come back to places like this. So the prophet of the exile, Ezekiel, when he's preaching to his exilic generation, those who were taken to Babylon for about 70 years, there was a faithful remnant that went with this group over here, goes to Babylon with the majority of unfaithful. They go to Babylon, and then they are taken away from their cities and their capital cities, and they lose their temple, and they're over there. And the prophet that God raises up is Ezekiel. He starts to have church. And over time and through his influence, there's this growing group of faithful remnant that gets bigger through the experience of hardship. And they grow, and at the proper time, God raises up the Cyrus decree to allow this group to come back. 22,000 approximately plus faithful Jews return to the promised land to rebuild and replant and get back to the activity of covenant living. So the refining aspects of the wilderness experience is what is interesting. Out of this passage, Moses doesn't downplay the hardship. You notice that? We still had to walk. Our feet didn't swell. We were thirsty. We were hungry, but the Lord provided. Your clothing didn't wear out during this time. But all the while, through the difficulty and through the hardship, what's the theological kind of purpose here. He let us be humbled. He held our hand, but he didn't pick us up and carry us. So there were 2 sets of footprints on the beach, sorry. But it was like a father disciplining his son in verse 5. So it was tough love, this idea of tough love. Sometimes when we have difficulty with this, we've got this divine pressure that is exerted against us. Tough love in return. When the love that he wants coming from this heart is a little bit tainted or a little bit stained or tarnished and needs a little bit of refining, he exerts a little bit of tough love of his own. So that's that refining, that testing idea that we saw, and we've been talking about this testing in the wilderness, and that's what he comes back to in verse 2. Moses says, this was testing. You were being refined, and that's what had to happen. So we get our hearts around this idea, and it's helpful in your all's ministry when you are helping people who are going through difficult times, Is it something that it helps us to understand, people ask the why question, and sometimes there is no real quick answer as to terms of why, but we can tell them of the what next. We can remind them and encourage them. But through this, I don't know why, but one thing I know is true is that the Lord hasn't given up on you. And we are to walk. And sometimes it's hard, but we keep walking. And we encourage those who are hurting in our congregations to just keep walking, like Israel had to keep walking in the wilderness. And as a result of this, the intimacy grows. Israel's intimate knowledge of God at the back end of this experience increased. Intimate knowledge of who God is, the fullness of who God is was revealed in the wilderness. They got to see him providing in his fidelity and his faithfulness, up close and personal. All of that was true. So sometimes that's what happens. Jesus quotes this in his wilderness experience in Matthew 4:4. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. But here in chapter 8, after this little section, we transition now to verse 11. And let's see, Braden, are you here? Right here? Could you read the beginning of verse 11 in chapter 8?
Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws and his decrees that I am giving you on this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through this vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land. With venomous snakes and scorpions, he brought you water from hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known. To humble and to test you, so you may end it and might go well with you. You say to yourself, my power and my strength of my hands have been producing this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. So confirm his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today. If you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you that today that you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations of the Lord destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord your God.
Now, just some of this harsh language we see, we have to understand to perish as a nation means to be exiled. When you cease to exist as a nation, when you're aka destroyed, it means you lose your land, you lose your temple, you lose your king, and then you cease to exist as a nation. So I think a lot of that might be going on here in terms of the emphasis. So he's got the fork in the road now, pretty much, hardwired into the way ahead. So you see the road of blessing, prosperity, not health and wealth gospel. I'm not talking about that here. But this is all attached to a heart with ears and feet, and the way that we move ahead. So this thread of forgetting comes back again in chapter 8, repeated from chapter 7. and it's a real threat. Moses knows this people, he knows the tendencies, he knows the real dangers that are around, lurking around, and this was a spiritual battle. There was a spiritual battle that was really being set up to be fought. And like I've said before, it's not so much unpacked in places like this in the scripture, but the unseen spiritual battle where you have real little g gods who are really in existence, but in the unseen realms, you've got satanic influence behind paganism. I think that's pretty well founded. And even back then in these days, you've got pagan people groups who are well entrenched into their pagan ways. They've been led down the wrong path, and now they are sacrificing their children when they have church. They are redefining their sexual boundaries and pagan prostitution and all of these perverted expressions that they've dove into. A lot of people there are trapped. So maybe the most loving thing to do is for God to bring judgment against people like that. And that's what's going to happen. That's kind of the backside of this, what's next. And what Israel is going to accomplish is actually long-term a benefit to the nations, because that can't continue to happen, especially in the Promised Land. So that's where we're going with as we move ahead. So let's move ahead to the next idea here. Now here's kind of a every now and then I can bring in an idea that your professor's been musing on and kind of trying to think about in new ways. So it's kind of like a research exercise I've been looking at. It kind of keeps coming back. So when something like that keeps coming back in my thoughts and my own study, it's like, maybe I'm onto something, you know. So this is like research. It's not heresy. It's not something to break a church up over. But it's kind of a new way of linking together some pretty significant theological themes in the biblical text. Now, we're going to get to the book of Judges at the end of this semester, so I'm giving you kind of advanced warning on this. Let's turn to the very last verse that we'll be actually talking about in this class. The very last verse in the book of Judges. So this is for free. I'm not going to charge you extra for this. I'm not going to raise your tuition just because I'm introducing this topic into this class. You just have to promise me that you don't go off and write an ETS paper on it and steal it from me, because I don't know. I'm not seeing this a lot in the commentaries or anything. Sometimes I have to check, and sometimes I find out, somebody's already thought of this, but it might be because I'm wrong, but I'm still trying to evaluate myself on this. So I'm on the hermeneutical spiral. It's like that little durable habit trail wheel that you jump on and you spin around when you're trying to wrestle some text to the ground and really get to the end of it and try to fully understand it. You have to have a willingness to say, I could be wrong, or I need to be corrected if I am. So let's take a look. There we go. The thesis statement of the book of Judges. You see it. And the author of Judges, he puts it at the very end of his book. And you know this phrase. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did that was right in his own eyes. You all know that. You've heard that before, right? Oft times preached. Some of you probably have used it in your Sunday school classes and youth groups. So this idea. There was no king in Israel. Everyone was doing that was right in his own eyes. So typically when you get to that verse in Judges, most will say what we are looking at there is the anticipation of what the author is trying to do and saying he's just evaluated historically and theologically this 400-year period we call the dark days of the Judges. So the whole book of Judges is 400 years of spiritual chaos. Things are not going well. We'll see. They go like a flushing of a toilet, spiraling out of control but downward. Cycle after cycle of Judge gets worse and worse and worse. And you get to the end, the author's like, had enough, and he drops that thesis statement down. He says, there was no king in Israel. So the assumption is, well, we need a king. We need a king. So what's going to happen next? God raises up Samuel, who eventually will rise up as the last judge and serve and issue in a transition to our first king, Saul. False start. Finally, we get to David. Sigh of relief. Everything's better. Everything's okay. Davidic covenant. there we go. That's the climax. And it's the Judges, the author of Judges, that's making this statement. So his theological correction, he's saying, we think, we just need a king. And that's who we have in King David, who's eventually going to come on the scene. Is that right? I ask the question, is that fully right? Is that all that the author is saying? What if he's had his quiet time in Deuteronomy, and he's looked at some of these passages that we've just got done looking at? So you have the combination of this picture here with the call to hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, and all of this, what Moses has talked about with this theology of forgetting. So what about this? What if we say, I think I can get this on the big screen here. So this idea of there was no king in Israel. So we've talked about this as a look ahead. That's certainly true. It's going to anticipate some transition. Israel then move into this new place of having a king they've not had before. That's not entirely true, is it? What if we do this? What if the author of Judges is making a theological assessment of the past and recognizing that Israel should have had a king all along? God is king. We talked about in this class, from the very beginning the Pentateuch establishes, over here, God is king. And maybe the author of Judges is making this point, theological undercurrent for his whole book is this: 400 years of forgetting that God is king. There was no king in Israel. I see you shaking your head. If you shake your head in my class, I know I'm right.
Yes.
I know I'm onto something. All right. God is king, but there was no king in Israel. 400 years worth of forgetting God. And that's what Moses warns against. So yes, there's got to be a king. Now, I need to erase this just to make room here. Sorry, I'm going to erase that now. We'll probably draw it again later. So yes, if the author of Judges is evaluating this period, he's saying, Israel's acting like there's no king, aka forgetting God. So we need a king, true. But what's this new king going to look like? Right? Well, he's got to be the right kind of king to have any kind of positive effect on the what next for Israel. So maybe, this is where it gets a little on the edge, but maybe the author of the book of Judges has a little bit of prophet in him. That's totally speculation. But if he's pointing ahead to a king, I wonder if there's a little bit of anticipation of what we eventually will see when the prophet Nathan raises up his oracle with King David. He starts to talk about, this is the kind of king that's going to emerge. There's a certain kind of king. There was no king in Israel, but the king, as we move forward, is going to have this element, but also the human element combined. God-man. Maybe a dual king in terms of humanity and deity. So I'm just interested in that. Certainly, we've got earthly kings that are coming down the road. King David will be one of the high points. But quite frankly, the earthly king idea, as we'll see with other biblical authors next semester, that's just a futility exercise. Earthly kings are obviously not going to come up. I mean, aside from a few reforming kings, they're not getting Israel back to where they need to be. So there's this, and that's what we see with the prophets. The prophets will come on the scene. All of the prophets start to anticipate, I think, this idea. Because they recognize and they hear from the Lord, and through the divine inspiration that they receive, they're anticipating. You saw me draw this picture in the very first semester, this long line. And this is the future king who is anticipated, and the prophets start to anticipate with the coming day of the Lord. So there's going to be a king. And I think all of this kind of fits together really nicely. So anyway, so that's a little bit for free there. So basically, it's just the thesis statement. The new thing that I don't see a lot of is, can the author of Judges, the question I'm asking, be looking ahead, but also be mindful of looking back? And maybe he's got this idea on his theological heart. There was no king in Israel, 400 years of forgetting the Lord, based on what Moses has warned them about, right? So again, he's a prophet, he's an author, but he's evaluated this period and said, we all should have known better. We forgot the Lord. Moses warned against that. So we'll come back to that when we get to the book of Judges a little bit later on. All right. But yeah, no king in Israel, that's what it looks like when you have no king. He's not sitting on his throne. So forgetting the Lord, Moses warns against that. So I think I've covered that enough. So let's move on. In the book of now we're back to the book of Deuteronomy. He's going to now start to unpack some things that are very specific in terms of Israel maintaining holiness, and all of those things that tie into their status as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. There's some teachings that really are very practical because they're as we'll see, very vital to the maintaining of that status. And let's take a look at a few of them in the specifics. Let's look at chapter 13 and verses. Let's see, have Ryan. Where are you? Ryan, I know you're here. He was here. No, not here. How about Jonathan over here? Why don't we have you read there in chapter 13, verses 1 through 5.
A prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder. And if the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, let us go after other gods, which you had not known, let us serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God is testing you, to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him, and keep his commandments and obey his voice. You shall serve him and shall fast it. But that prophet or dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has taught rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you out of the house of slavery to make you lead the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall purge the evil from your midst.
What? That sounds awfully mean and harsh. Maybe Richard Dawkins is right. This is the mean God of the Old Testament. This is the God who talks a lot about killing, right? Here we have, is this stoning? Is this one of those mean stoning passages? Oh, it's not mentioned. Put to death. Well, that's pretty mild. How are we supposed to understand? Oh, don't walk out. I didn't want to offend you. No, go ahead. I had a student once in all the 10 years that I've been teaching here walk out of my class because they didn't like what I said. One student. Actually, it was a college class I taught once where I had to cover all 39 books of the Old Testament in one semester. So yeah, I was teaching on the book of Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon. And when I talk about that book, if you stay with me through third semester, you'll hear me talk about that book. There's sex that's talked about in that book. Intimacy in a relationship, it's there. But she was offended and she walked out of my class and she said, we are not supposed to be talking about this topic in a college level class. She never came back. I was sad, and all my, the students in the class were all like, wow, what just happened, And, but I actually, when she left, I turned to the students and I said, this is exactly the reason we need to be talking about this. Because the world out there is absolutely befuddled and confused about the elevation and the celebration of the sexual intimacy between a couple in love. And if there's any place for the watching world to look and see what that looks like, it ought to be with married Christian couples in the context of our churches. So all of you singles out there, I said to the class, this is what you strive to, and this is what you look forward to. An opportunity to be a walking billboard of this book, Song of Solomon, in your marriage life, in the context of your marriage. And that people are confused about this. And King Solomon was writing this, and probably not talking about his own life, but a couple that he knew in his kingdom as an example, and in a very poetic way, leaves this theological masterpiece for his kingdom. He says, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. He's writing at the end of his life, and he says, here's what it should look like, kingdom. Here's what it looks like for a couple in love. And all the various stages of progression up to wedding night and then beyond are all there in the book. It's really pretty amazing. And that's the approach that I take on that book. So, but she didn't like it because we were talking about sex. But anyway, all that. Let's quickly move away from that to the next thing. So, in chapter 13, but the severity of this, that's what I was trying to get at. So what's the threat here? And how is it perceived in the context, the broader context of what we've been talking about up until now? So as Israel goes to the land, there's the threat of paganism. And here we have an example of a false prophet who comes in and in a very influential way starts to push his influence around and lead people astray. Lead people towards paganism. I think that's what I see here in the in-betweens. Serving other gods. Don't listen to the words of Yahweh. So this is high treason. So we do have capital offense laws against these kinds of things because of what's at stake. The spiritual vitality, look, is all on the back of Israel as a nation corporately, following through faithfully. So yes, this is a threat against the nation. This is a threat that puts other people's lives in jeopardy. That's what's at stake. And it does. It puts other people's lives at risk. So, because if this continues, this kind of activity continues, then Israel will be led down the road towards paganism. And we already know Moses has said, if that happens, Israel can't stay in the land. So yes, people's lives are at stake. So capital offense laws come in to protect the vibrancy and the healthy and the vitality, helpfulness and vitality and all those good things within a community who's properly working together and functioning as a society. We have laws in our society to protect us against those kinds of mean people and influencers and all of that. So this is just the first of many that we'll see that come down the road with regards to these kinds of things. So, and here's some more, let's look at some other teachings with regards to holiness as it's supposed to permeate every nook and cranny of society. And there's lots of practical things that we see. Some of these things are somewhat radical, but let's take a look at chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. I just picked a few. We don't have time to cover every jot and tittle. I did teach Deuteronomy verse by verse one semester. That was a lot of fun. Every verse, even the hard ones, we have to cover. So it's possible to even preach through Deuteronomy verse by verse, and you will have a lot of, in this context, practical things for your people walking away with. And this even affects the economy. So let's take a look at the sabbatic year. We've already heard about the sabbatic year. We talked about it, but he's bringing it back because it's important for this new generation. At the end of every 7 years, he shall grant a remission of debts. Let's just stop there. That's radical. You cannot build an economy on debt. You cannot build an economy. Israel, you cannot build an economy on charging interest forever and ever. You cannot. So it limits the economy based on credit card debt. Like they didn't have credit cards back then, but you still would have to owe people. You could owe people money and they charge you interest over time. All of that was limited. So, and this is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. From a foreigner you may exact it. But your hand shall release whatever of yours is within for your brother. However, there shall be no poor among you, since the Lord will surely bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess. If only you listen obediently here, there's our heart with ears, to the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all of his commandment, which I am commanding you today. It's just a reminder that the economy that the Lord's in charge of is going to be an economy of prosperity if Israel follows through. Of course, the scaredy cats in the economic world are going to say, "Oh, I don't know if I can do that. I'm going to lose all my money." And there's a reminder here that if you do these things, everybody's going to profit, even the poor. You're going to be able to, but because of the bounty that will be coming your way, you'll be able to provide for the needs of the poor, the aliens, and the widows, and the orphans in your community as well. It'll be a double blessing. Just watch. Trust me on this, the Lord says to Israel, and I'll follow through. And you'll see. There'll be more surplus than you'll know what to do with if you don't build your economy on debt and charging interest and taking advantage of the poor and needy, which, by the way, is what the pagans are doing. But you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to build your economy the way the pagans do. So that could be a sermon for some of us. It's radical in how to apply that. I'm still trying to get my brain around it for practical. That's the challenge, though. We want to look at something like this for what it was like in its day. And the walk-away for us is the challenge. As we make this alive for our congregations is to, here's the timeless principle. Here's the timeless truth. Here's some ideas on how to put feet to this and apply it for our modern day. So there's probably some Dave Ramsey principles somewhere attached to that as well in terms of debt. All right, chapter 15, down here in verses 12 through 18. So this applies, this idea of the sabbatical principle is also interesting. Verse 12, if your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year, the sabbatic year, you shall set him free. And when you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, from your wine vat. You shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you, and therefore I command you to this day. So, servants, slaves, household servants, so the household structure, maybe there's someone in the community that would need something, and you as a household business operator would do something to provide for and bless that person. It's possible that they could become a part of your household servant community, work off that debt, but up to 7 years. And then it's no longer. And that person's returned to their home, to their household, not only empty-handed, but with pockets full and fully provided for. Isn't that interesting? That's radical. You see how, and radically different than the pagan world that treated their slaves and servants with much more, taking advantage of situations. So it's a radical system. So the 6 years, then 7 cycle, what this does for the economy, it opens up room, the capacity for God to bless his people. Debt and all this other stuff gets in the way. It clogs the pipes. God's wanting to bless his people. You see that all of these things are linked to this idea of blessing. You see it in verse 4. Surely bless you in the land. Verse 6. For the Lord your God will bless you. Verse 6. Verse 10. You shall. So the Lord your God will bless you in all your work. Verse 14. So the Lord your God has blessed you. You see it in verse 14, verse 18, all this blessing that's going to happen. On number 2, it eliminates the poor class in your community because the poor are always there and they risk being taken advantage of by the wealthy. So in Israelite economy, the poor will be elevated and the rich won't be so rich, something like that. But you see elements of this later. The prophets, like Amos in chapter 2, verse 6, is going to rail against Israel for them taking advantage of the poor and the needy in their community. Israel has walked away from the original design and principle. They're taking advantage of the poor and needy. They're changing the weights of the scales on the city streets where people buy and exchange things and sell grain. The wealthy who run the businesses on the streets are changing the scale weight so they take advantage. They skim off a little bit extra every time a transaction takes place. That's what Amos addresses in his book. Also, what does this cycle do? Number 3, it restores dignity to the human being by allowing him to be debt-free and servitude-free. I don't owe anybody anything. That restores dignity. I can live free. I'm not under the ball and chain of owing somebody. And that's radical. I wish we could get more like that in our culture, our society. And it controls the limit of debt by only debt within that 6-year period. After that, it's wiped clean. So during that time period, you design your transaction so that it's got a 6-year cutoff. You can work for me, you can serve me for 6 years, but then your job's done. Your job is over. You're not working for me anymore. You can go back to your family. You've paid back everything that you owe me. And I'm even going to be generous to you and give you a little extra to go home with because I know that the Lord's going to be blessing me this next year with my business. So that's part of the deal. So God's going to come through at his end of it. All right, let's keep going here. Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17. There's all kinds of things that are real practical. Let's look at verses 1 through 9. Let's see. Mark, right here. Go ahead and read for us in chapter 17, verses 1 through 9.
Sure. You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep in which is a blemish, any defect whatever, for that is an abomination to the Lord your God. If there is found among you within any of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you a man or woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God in transgressing his covenant, and has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, or the sun or the moon or any of the host of heaven, which I forbid it, and it is told you, and you hear of it, then you shall inquire diligently. And if it is true and certain that such an abomination has been done in Israel, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman who has done this evil thing, and you shall stone that man or woman to death with stones. On the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. The person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. The hand of the witnesses shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you shall purge the evil from your midst.
Keep going.
If any case arises requiring decision between one kind of homicide and another, one kind of legal right and another, or one kind of assault and another, any case within your town is too difficult for you, then you shall arise and go up to the place that the Lord your God will choose. And you shall come to the Levitical priests and to the judge who is in the office